European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is in Ukraine for the third time since the start of the war. Her visit comes as Russia launches more attacks on Ukrainian soil, including a missile strike on a reservoir near President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown. It's a week since Ukraine's counter-offensive saw Russian troops retreat from parts of the northeast.
Like a meeting between old friends. On her third visit to Ukraine since the war began, Ursula von der Leyen received a warm welcome from President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and an award for her commitment to EU-Ukraine relations. Among the talking points, the 8 million plus people who fled to EU countries since the war began in February.
We want, of course, to give our Ukrainian friends, when they need help, as much support as possible. But we also know that they are longing to go home again.
Even as von der Leyen's night train made its way to Kyiv, Russian rockets struck a reservoir dam in Kryvyi Rih, an industrial centre and President Zelensky's hometown. The resulting flood inundated several roads and houses, and the local drinking water supply was cut.
The drains aren't working and we can't flush the toilet. Everything's flooded and there's been no one from the Disaster Protection Agency here since yesterday evening.
President Zelenskyy said the Russian strikes on the city so close to his roots had no military value, and Zelenskyy said that fact shows Russia is intent on attacking Ukrainian civilians.
Kyiv is the second largest city in Ukraine. Despite being only 40 kilometres from the Russian border, Ukraine's military has kept the Russians from occupying it. But the city has faced relentless artillery fire since the war began. This is Kyiv's regional council building. It was struck by a Russian missile in early March, leaving only its facade standing. 6 months on, construction work is underway. The rest of the city centre also bears the scars of indiscriminate daily shelling. That and the intense artillery battles that continued into the summer have prompted thousands of civilians to flee the once thriving city. I spoke to DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who's following the latest developments for us from Kyiv. I asked him about the situation in the city.
Well, as you can probably see behind me, there is very little of Kharkiv to be seen at a pretty early evening hour because lots of people, it often feels in the centre like the majority have left, and the ones who are remaining are sticking to all the recommendations, keeping their curtains firmly shut and basically keeping off the streets. It's pretty extraordinary to be in a city of more than 1.5 million and occasionally only to see some cars passing a distance, a few very rare pedestrians. But it's a real contrast to the times before this war started. I was here in mid-February when the US government said that the war was imminent and people here just couldn't get their heads around it. They couldn't believe that this was on the cards, and this was a thriving city with also tens of thousands of foreign students coming here from around the world who also took their cue from the locals and were convinced that being 40 kilometres away from Russia didn't necessarily mean that they were in danger. Now, since this Ukrainian assault counteroffensive in the northeast of the country has done so well, we've seen some Russian retaliation attacks, we've seen attacks on the energy infrastructure, on the power system, the heating system rather, and extraordinarily it's proved pretty flexible and resilient and able to restore those systems. For the most part, power is back, the metro is operating, and even though, as I mentioned, so many people have left, those remaining are keeping the show on the road. But the question looking now towards the next few months is, even if Russian forces are no longer in this part of the country, they are still only, as you mentioned, they're 40 kilometres away on their own territory, so the risk of attacks, of missile attacks, of long-distance artillery, that is still very much there. Yesterday evening we heard a big explosion in the downtown not far from our hotel, and the air raid sirens only came on about 3-4 minutes afterwards. So often it's so difficult to really tell when these things are coming, and they're coming from such a short distance that the systems here just can't really give anyone a feeling of safety or the real chance to get to a position where they can be protected from damage. So it is a very edgy situation in a city that doesn't really quite know yet whether to believe that the situation is genuinely safer and whether it's kind of time to go back to some kind of normality.
And Nick, I believe you've been to the border region with Russia north of Kyiv, where Russian troops only pulled out a matter of days ago. Tell us more about what you saw.
Well, this was an area that is, as you mentioned, they're so close to the border, and where you can still hear artillery fire pretty much every 10-15 minutes. Those battles are still going on there, and the people who had remained in those villages were kind of dazed and kind of shocked to see outsiders. They'd also been cut off from the outside world, or at least from Kharkiv and from Ukrainian-controlled territory for 6 months. So the Russian army basically turned up there within the first few hours of this war, and people there talking about rebuilding their houses time and time again. One older woman we spoke to had just about rebuilt her roof when, just a couple of days before the Ukrainian force came back, her house was basically destroyed, and she's now trying to work out where she's going to spend the winter. People telling us of being taken to cellars, to being mistreated by the Russian authorities because they have family ties to people serving in the Ukrainian army. One man we saw was just recovering some medals that belonged to a relative of his, Ukrainian army medals, that he'd hidden to make sure that the Russians didn't know about quite how illustrious his relative's career had been. People who had disappeared, who still haven't been found or heard of for months. And we even saw what we were told were the remains of some Ukrainian soldiers who died there pretty early on in this war and who the Russian authorities hadn't buried. A sense also that the Russian forces there had left in great haste. Bits of tech, armoured vehicles dumped, paperwork. Even we saw a drawing from seemingly the child of one of the Russian soldiers there, sent to the father who was serving in Ukraine, with that Z symbol that we've seen on all those Russian troop cars. So a real sense that this was an area that really was abandoned at great haste, and there's definitely the suspicion from lots of people on the ground that there are still Russian forces, Russian soldiers hiding in abandoned houses who just basically didn't manage to get out in time and are now trying to find some way of getting out without being caught.
That was DW's Nick Connolly reporting from the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv.